Before the British Empire became the global power we know, there was a time of exploration, rivalries, and ambition. Join us in the 16th century to discover how this story began. It all started with a man named John Cabot. In 1497, this Venetian navigator serving England reached what we now know as Canada. Although his expedition did not lead to immediate colonization, it opened the door for future British ambitions. But England was not the only nation eager for exploration. Spain and Portugal had already claimed vast territories in America and Asia. To compete, the English began financing expeditions and attacking Spanish ships, led by figures like Francis Drake. In 1607, the British founded Jamestown, the first permanent colony in North America. It was not an easy start. Disease, hunger, and conflicts with indigenous peoples threatened its survival, but eventually the colony managed to establish itself. The British Empire was not just seeking territories, but also trade. During the 17th century, the British East India Company was established, an organization that would lay the foundations for British dominance in India and open the doors to an unprecedented commercial empire. Through exploration, trade, and rivalry with other powers, England began its transformation into an empire. After the first British settlements in America and Asia, England's ambition grew. Throughout the 17th century, the British Crown began consolidating its dominance, facing challenges and expanding its trade network. British colonies in North America and the Caribbean grew rapidly. In 1620, the Pilgrims founded Plymouth, while in the Caribbean, England seized islands like Jamaica from Spain, turning them into centers for sugar production and the slave trade. The rise of British trade was based on a system known as the triangular trade. British ships transported manufactured goods to Africa, exchanging them for enslaved people who were sent to America. From there, products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton were shipped to Europe, generating enormous wealth for the empire. In Asia, the British East India Company consolidated its power in India. Through trade agreements and alliances with local rulers, the British began exerting control over vast territories, laying the foundation for their dominance in the subcontinent. Britain's growth did not go unnoticed. France, Spain, and the Netherlands competed for control of key territories. The Anglo-Dutch Wars and the 9 Years' War were among the conflicts in which Britain fought to secure its maritime and colonial supremacy. By the late 17th century, the British Empire had secured a global presence. With colonies in America, the Caribbean, and Asia, Great Britain was on its way to becoming the world's leading power in the centuries to come. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict that pitted the major European powers against each other and changed the balance of power in the world. For Britain, this war marked the consolidation of its naval supremacy and the expansion of its empire. The conflict began in North America, where British and French colonies fought for control of the Ohio Valley. In 1754, clashes between British and French troops escalated into a larger war. By 1756, the conflict had expanded. Britain's naval superiority allowed it to blockade French supplies, while on land, British forces, along with their indigenous allies, began gaining ground. The war was not limited to America. In Europe, Britain, allied with Prussia, fought against France, Austria, and Spain. Meanwhile, in India and the Caribbean, the British attacked French positions, securing their commercial and territorial dominance. In 1763, the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. France ceded Canada and eastern Louisiana to Britain, while Spain handed over Florida. Britain had now emerged as the world's greatest colonial power. British victory had enormous consequences. Although Britain became the dominant power, the high cost of the war led to new taxes on the American colonies, laying the foundation for the American Revolution. By the late 18th century, the British Empire faced one of the greatest challenges in its history. The 13 colonies in North America rebelled against British rule, igniting the American Revolution, a conflict that would change the fate of the empire. The war didn't start out of nowhere. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain imposed new taxes on the colonies to recover its finances. Laws like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act sparked outrage, leading colonists to demand no taxation without representation. In April 1775, the first shots of the war were fired at Lexington and Concord. Soon the colonists organized an army under George Washington's leadership, and in 1776, they declared independence from Britain. Though the British had a stronger army, the war was not easy. The colonial troops used guerrilla tactics, and France, Spain, and the Netherlands supported the rebels. The war dragged on with victories and defeats for both sides. In 1781, the British defeat at Yorktown marked the beginning of the end. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States, signifying the first major loss of the British Empire. The loss of the 13 colonies forced Britain to restructure its empire. Despite the setback, the United Kingdom shifted its focus to India and other colonies, laying the foundation for its future expansion in the 19th century. After the loss of the 13 colonies, the British Empire focused its efforts on India. Through the British East India Company, Britain transitioned from a trading power to the dominant force in the subcontinent. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey marked a turning point. With Mir Jafar's betrayal, the British, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and established their control over the region. During the 19th century, the East India Company solidified its dominance through treaties, wars, and annexations. The doctrine of lapse allowed Britain to seize territories without legitimate heirs. British rule transformed India's economy and society. Cash crops like opium and cotton were imposed, benefiting Britain. Meanwhile, railways and infrastructure projects modernized transportation and trade. In 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, revolted against British rule. Although the rebellion was crushed, it marked the end of the East India Company's control and the beginning of direct British rule under the Raj in 1858. British occupation left a lasting impact on India. Despite infrastructure advancements, British rule brought economic exploitation and social unrest, fueling the independence movement in the 20th century. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire had reached its greatest expansion and power under Queen Victoria's reign. With colonies on every continent, Britain became the dominant global power, a period known as the Victorian era. Britain led the Industrial Revolution, producing more goods than ever before. Its economy flourished thanks to global trade, driven by its colonies, which supplied raw materials such as cotton, tea, and minerals. The 19th century saw British expansion in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Control of Egypt and the Suez Canal strengthened its grip on trade routes, while the colonization of Australia, Canada, and South Africa cemented its power. Despite its power, Britain faced numerous rebellions and conflicts. The Opium Wars in China, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and the Anglo-Zulu War in South Africa demonstrated resistance against British rule. Under Victoria, the empire not only expanded territorially, but also consolidated its governance. In 1877, she was proclaimed Empress of India, reflecting Britain's absolute rule over the subcontinent. The Victorian era brought advances in science, technology, and culture. The telegraph, railroads, and the growth of major cities marked a transformation in the lives of millions, leaving a legacy that still echoes today. In 1914, the world went to war, and the British Empire was drawn into one of history's most devastating conflicts. With troops from across its colonies, Britain fought on multiple fronts, facing immense challenges and transformations. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany following the invasion of Belgium. As a global power, the British Empire mobilized not only its troops, but also vast colonial resources. Millions of soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Africa were sent to fight in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The war was not just British, it was imperial. The British Empire fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles, the Somme, Gallipoli, and Passchendaele. Trench warfare and high casualties left a deep impact on the nation and its colonies. The war weakened Britain economically and strengthened nationalist movements in its colonies. The contributions of colonial soldiers led to growing demands for independence in places like India and Ireland. In 1918, the war ended with an Allied victory. At the Treaty of Versailles, Britain gained new territories, but its empire would never be the same again. In 1939, the world plunged into war once again. Britain and its vast empire faced another global conflict, but this time, the struggle would mark the beginning of the end of British dominance. From the outset, the British Empire played a crucial role in the fight against the Axis powers. Troops from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa were sent to fight in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Britain withstood the German bombing campaign in the Battle of Britain, while its troops fought in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. However, the war also drained its economy and resources. In 1942, the fall of Singapore to Japan was a devastating blow to Britain's image of invincibility. Millions in the colonies realized the empire was not indestructible. By the war's end in 1945, Britain emerged victorious but economically exhausted. Its global influence weakened and independence movements across its colonies gained momentum. World War II was the turning point for the British Empire. In the years that followed, India and other colonies would gain independence, marking the collapse of British global rule. After World War II, the British Empire was no longer the dominant power it had been for centuries. Economic pressure, rising nationalism in the colonies, and the influence of new powers like the United States and the Soviet Union signaled the beginning of the end for the world's largest empire. The independence of India in 1947 was the biggest blow to the British Empire. After years of struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, Britain granted independence, dividing the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. Following India's independence, other Asian and African countries followed the same path. Burma and Ceylon gained independence in 1948, while in the 1950s and 1960s, African nations like Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya broke colonial ties with Britain. In 1956, the Suez Crisis showed that Britain was no longer a global superpower. When it attempted to regain control of the Suez Canal in Egypt, pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union forced the British to withdraw, marking an international humiliation. During the 1960s and 1970s, many Caribbean islands and Pacific territories gained independence. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados were among the first to separate from British rule. The last great symbol of the British Empire fell in 1997 when Hong Kong was handed back to China after more than 150 years of British rule. With this transfer, the British Empire officially came to an end. Although the British Empire officially ended in the 20th century, its influence remains present in many aspects of the modern world. From politics to culture, Britain's impact is still felt in former colonies and beyond. After decolonization, many former colonies chose to maintain ties with Britain through the Commonwealth. This organization brings together over 50 countries that share a common history and cooperate on political and economic issues. Many former colonies adopted government systems based on the British model. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, and common law remain in place in nations such as Canada, Australia, and India. One of the most enduring legacies of the British Empire is the spread of the English language. Today, English is the most widely spoken language in the world, used in business, technology, and diplomacy. The trade routes established during the British Empire continue to shape the global economy. London remains one of the world's leading financial centers, and former colonies maintain strong trade relations with the UK. British education, cricket, football, and other cultural traditions spread worldwide thanks to the empire. Institutions such as Oxford and Cambridge remain global educational leaders. The British Empire left a deep mark on human history. Though its rule has ended, its legacy lives on in politics, economics, culture, and language. Today, the world continues to debate its effects, both positive and negative. We've explored the history of the British Empire together, from its beginnings to its lasting impact on the modern world. If you love history and want to keep discovering the events that have shaped our reality, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos, and leave us a comment with your thoughts or suggestions for future topics. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey, and see you in the next video.